nearly 500,000 customers just caught up in this massive data breach.
Oh, right. I think they said it was a software glitch.
Ah,
But still, pretty wild that something like that could expose so much sensitive information. Names, addresses, social security numbers. I mean, even bank account details were compromised. It really makes you wonder about the security of our whole financial system.
yeah, like we all think of these banks as these super secure digital Fort Knoxes, but incidents like that really show how vulnerable they can be.
Exactly. It's a constant battle for them to stay ahead of the cyber criminals. And the stakes are incredibly high.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we're going to be diving into today, right? The whole landscape of cybersecurity and banking in 2025.
That's right.
We've got a ton of fascinating information here, reports, articles, expert opinions. The goal for us today is to cut through all the noise and really get to the heart of what's going on. So by the end of this, you should have a much clearer picture of the challenges banks are facing right now and the strategies they're using to try and stay ahead of the game.
Sounds good.
Think of it as your crash course in banking cybersecurity without all the super technical jargon.
I like it.
All right, so let's jump right in. When we look at the cybersecurity landscape in 2025, what are the really big threats that banks have to be ready for?
Well, there are a number of them, but a few really stand out. First off, you've got these things called advanced persistent threats, or APTs for short.
APTs, okay.
And what makes these so tricky is that they're not just about getting in. It's about staying hidden once they're inside. We're talking about intruders who can infiltrate a bank's network and then operate undetected for a really long time, sometimes even months or years.
Wow, so it's kind of like a silent infiltration?
Exactly. And during that time, they can do a lot of damage. Steal sensitive data, siphon off funds, you name it. By the time they're discovered, the impact can be huge.
That's scary. And then, of course, there's the one that seems to be all over the news these days. Ransomware. It feels like every other week there's another story about some organization getting hit with a ransomware attack. Are banks still a big target for that kind of thing?
Oh, absolutely. Ransomware is still a massive threat, and it's only getting more sophisticated. The way it works is cyber criminals use malicious software to encrypt a bank's critical data, basically locking them out of their own systems. Then they demand a ransom payment in exchange for the decryption key.
Like holding their data hostage.
Exactly. And the ransoms can be enormous. We're talking millions of dollars in some cases. What's particularly worrying is that these attacks are becoming much more targeted. It's not just about spraying and praying anymore. These criminals are doing their research, identifying specific vulnerabilities, and launching very precise attacks.
So it's getting harder and harder for banks to protect themselves.
Definitely. They have to be constantly on guard, constantly updating their defenses.
And then on top of all that, we've got this whole new dimension to worry about. Artificial intelligence being used for malicious purposes. AI-enabled attacks. That sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie.
It does, doesn't it? But it's very real, and it's becoming a major concern. You see, cyber criminals are starting to use AI to create much more powerful and effective attacks.
How so?
Well, for example, think about phishing scams. You know, those emails that try to trick you into giving up your personal information? Well, imagine an AI-powered phishing campaign that can craft hyper-personalized emails tailored to each individual recipient. Those are going to be way harder to spot, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And then there are things like deepfake scams, where AI is used to create incredibly realistic fake videos or audio recordings. These could be used to impersonate bank executives, for example, or to manipulate customers into making unauthorized transactions.
Wow, it's like AI is giving cybercriminals a whole new arsenal of tools.
Exactly. It's a whole new level of sophistication and deception. And it's something that banks really need to be prepared for.
Now, with banks moving more and more of their operations to the cloud, does that create new security risks that they need to manage? I mean, it seems like having all that data stored somewhere out there in the ether could make it more vulnerable.
It definitely adds another layer of complexity. While cloud computing offers a lot of advantages for banks in terms of flexibility, scalability, and cost efficiency, it also brings with it a unique set of security challenges.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, you have to make sure that the data stored in the cloud is properly protected. That means strong encryption, both when the data is at rest and when it's being transmitted.
Okay, so encryption is key.
Absolutely. And then you need to make sure that access to that data is tightly controlled. That means multi-factor authentication for anyone who needs to access sensitive information. You know, that extra layer of security where you have to enter a code from your phone or use your fingerprint in addition to your password.
Right. Makes sense.
And then there's the issue of regular security audits. You need to make sure that your cloud provider is meeting the highest security standards and that there are no vulnerabilities in their systems.
It seems like there's a lot to think about when it comes to cloud security.
Yeah, it's a whole different ballgame. But it's something that banks are really focusing on because the cloud is becoming more and more essential to their operations.
And it's not just about the security of their own systems, right? Banks work with so many other companies these days. What about the risks that can come from third-party vendors? Like if a vendor has lax security, couldn't that become a backdoor for hackers to get into the bank's systems?
Absolutely, that's a huge concern. Banks rely on a whole ecosystem of third-party vendors for all sorts of things, from payment processing to data analytics to customer support. And if any one of those vendors has weak security practices, it could create a vulnerability that cybercriminals could exploit to target the bank.
So how do banks manage that risk?
Well, the key is something called third-party risk management. It's basically a whole process of identifying, assessing, and mitigating the risks associated with working with external vendors.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice?
It involves things like conducting thorough security assessments of potential vendors before you even start working with them. You want to make sure they have strong security practices in place and that their systems are up to par. And then, once you are working with a vendor, you need to have clear contracts and agreements in place that outline the security standards they're expected to meet. And you need to regularly monitor their compliance with those standards.
So it's all about due diligence and ongoing oversight.
Exactly. You can't just assume that your vendors are taking care of security. You have to be proactive and make sure they're doing everything they need to do to protect your data.
Now, on top of all that, it seems like the regulatory landscape around data protection and privacy is constantly changing. Just keeping up with all the rules and regulations must be a major challenge for banks.
Oh, absolutely. It's a huge challenge. There's a whole alphabet soup of regulations out there, GDPR, CCPA, GLBA, and more, and they're all constantly evolving. And these regulations have real teeth. Banks can face hefty fines and penalties if they're found to be in violation, so they have to be very careful about how they collect, store, and use customer data.
So compliance is a big part of the cybersecurity picture.
Oh, it's a huge part. In fact, in some ways, it's driving a lot of the security improvements that banks are making. Because in order to comply with these regulations, they have to implement strong security controls, they have to have robust data protection measures in place, and they have to be able to demonstrate that they're taking data privacy seriously.
It's like regulations are forcing them to up their security game.
Exactly. And in the long run, that's a good thing for everyone, right? Because it means that our data is more secure.
Makes sense. Now, something that might not immediately come to mind when we think about cybersecurity is the risk of insider threats. What are those, and how big of a problem are they for banks?
Insider threats are basically any security risks that originate from within the organization itself. It could mean a disgruntled employee who's trying to sabotage the bank, a careless employee who accidentally clicks on a phishing link, or even a well-meaning employee who unknowingly exposes sensitive data.
So it's not just about protecting against outside attackers. You have to worry about your own people as well.
Exactly. And insider threats can be really difficult to detect and prevent because these individuals already have legitimate access to the bank's systems and data. So you have to have strong internal controls in place to minimize the risk.
Like what kind of controls?
Well, for one thing, you need to have strict access controls so that employees only have access to the data they need to do their jobs. You also need to monitor user activity for any suspicious behavior, like someone accessing data they shouldn't be looking at or trying to download large amounts of data. And you need to have clear security policies in place that outline what's acceptable behavior and what's not.
So it's all about having a layered approach to security, both external and internal.
Precisely. You can't just focus on one or the other. You have to have a comprehensive security strategy that addresses all the potential threats.
All right, so that was a pretty thorough rundown of the threats facing banks in 2025, and it sounds like it's a pretty daunting landscape. So how are banks actually responding to all this? What are they doing to defend themselves against these increasingly sophisticated attacks?
Well, the good news is that banks are taking cybersecurity very seriously. They're investing heavily in new technologies and strategies to bolster their defenses. And we're seeing some really interesting developments in this area.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, banks are embracing artificial intelligence and machine learning in a big way. These technologies are revolutionizing cybersecurity, enabling banks to detect and respond to threats much more effectively.
Can you give us some specific examples?
Sure. So, for instance, AI-powered systems can analyze huge volumes of data in real time, looking for patterns and anomalies that might indicate a cyber attack. They can spot things that human analysts might miss, and they can do it much faster. This allows banks to detect threats earlier and respond more quickly, minimizing the potential damage.
So AI is like having an army of superpowered security guards constantly monitoring your systems.
Exactly. And it's not just about reactive security. AI can also be used to proactively harden systems, identifying vulnerabilities and patching them before attackers can exploit them.
It's like having a crystal ball that shows you where the attacks are going to come from before they even happen.
In a way, yeah. It's about predicting and preventing attacks rather than just reacting to them.
That's pretty impressive. Now, what about protecting customer data? That's obviously a huge concern for everyone. What specific measures are banks taking to safeguard our personal information?
Right. Well, first and foremost, banks are using strong encryption to protect sensitive data, both when it's stored and when it's being transmitted. That means scrambling the data so that it's unreadable to anyone who doesn't have the decryption key.
Encryption is like putting all our sensitive information in a vault.
Exactly. And then, in addition to encryption, banks are using multi-factor authentication to verify the identity of anyone trying to access sensitive data. So even if someone gets hold of your password, they still can't access your account without that second factor of authentication, like a code from your phone or your fingerprint.
So it's like having two locks on the vault door.
Precisely. It makes it much harder for attackers to get in. And then on top of all that, banks are conducting regular security audits and vulnerability assessments to make sure that their systems are up to par and that there are no weaknesses that attackers could exploit.
It sounds like they're really taking a multi-layered approach to security.
They have to. The threats are just too sophisticated to rely on a single layer of defense. You need multiple layers of protection overlapping and reinforcing each other.
Now, earlier we talked about fraud prevention. How are banks using technology to try and stop fraudulent activity before it even happens?
Well, this is another area where AI and machine learning are really making a difference. Banks are using these technologies to analyze huge volumes of transaction data, looking for patterns and anomalies that might indicate fraud.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. So let's say you suddenly start making a lot of purchases from different countries or trying to withdraw unusually large amounts of cash. That might trigger a red flag in the bank's fraud detection system. And if the system determines that the activity is suspicious enough, it might block the transactions and alert a human investigator to take a closer look.
So it's kind of like having a really smart detective constantly watching over your account, looking for any signs of trouble.
Exactly. And the beauty of AI is that it can learn and adapt over time. The more data it analyzes, the better it gets at spotting fraudulent activity.
Yeah.
So the systems are constantly improving, and the fraudsters are finding it harder and harder to get away with their scams.
That's reassuring. Now let's talk about those stealthy, advanced, persistent threats we discussed earlier. How are banks dealing with something that's designed to stay hidden? It seems like it would be really hard to detect those kinds of attacks.
It is. But banks are investing in sophisticated threat detection systems that are designed to spot even the most subtle signs of an APT.
How do those systems work?
Well, they use a variety of techniques, including behavioral analysis, anomaly detection, and threat intelligence. Basically, they're constantly monitoring the bank's network for any activity that deviates from the norm. And if they spot something suspicious, they'll alert security personnel who can then investigate further.
So it's about looking for those needles in the haystack, those tiny clues that might indicate something's wrong.
Exactly. And these systems are getting better and better at doing that. They're using AI to learn from past attacks, to identify new attack patterns, and to constantly refine their detection algorithms.
So it's like a constant arms race between the banks and the attackers.
That's a good way to put it. The attackers are always coming up with new ways to try and breach security, and the banks are always having to come up with new ways to defend themselves.
Now, ransomware attacks can be particularly disruptive. What strategies are banks using to make sure they can recover quickly if they do get hit with one?
Building ransomware resilience is a top priority for banks. They know that it's not a matter of if they'll get hit, but when, so they're focusing on being prepared.
What does that preparedness look like?
Well, first and foremost, it means having robust data backups. If your data is encrypted by ransomware, you need to be able to restore it from a clean backup. So banks are making sure that their backups are frequent, secure, and tested regularly.
So backups are like having an insurance policy in case something bad happens.
Exactly. And then in addition to backups, banks are also focusing on strengthening their endpoint security. That means making sure that all the devices connected to their network, like laptops and smartphones, are protected with strong antivirus software and other security measures. Because often, ransomware attacks start with a single compromised device.
So it's about preventing those initial infections.
Right. And then finally, banks are developing comprehensive incident response plans. These plans outline exactly what steps they'll take if they do get hit with a ransomware attack. They cover everything from containment and eradication to communication and recovery.
So it's like having a playbook for how to handle a crisis.
Exactly. The idea is to be able to respond quickly and effectively, minimizing the impact of the attack.
Earlier, we talked about regulatory compliance as being a major challenge for banks. Is adhering to those regulations also considered a key cybersecurity measure in itself?
Absolutely. Compliance and cybersecurity go hand in hand. In fact, a lot of the security best practices that banks are implementing are driven by regulatory requirements. Well, for example, regulations like GDPR and CCPA mandate that banks have strong data protection measures in place. They have to encrypt sensitive data, they have to implement access controls, they have to have procedures for handling data breaches, and so on. So by complying with these regulations, banks are actually raising their overall level of security.
It's like regulations are forcing them to adopt best practices.
In a way, yes. And that's a good thing, because it means that customer data is more protected.
Makes sense. Now, with more and more banking services moving to the cloud, what are some of the specific security measures that are being implemented to protect that environment?
Cloud security is a top priority for banks. They know that they need to take extra precautions to protect their data in the cloud.
What kind of precautions?
Well, for one thing, they're making sure that their cloud providers have strong security practices in place. They're carefully vetting their providers, looking at their security certifications, their track record, and their overall security posture.
So it's about choosing the right cloud provider to begin with.
Right. And then once they've chosen a provider, they're working closely with them to implement strong security controls. That means things like encryption, access controls, multi-factor authentication, and regular security audits.
It sounds like it's a collaborative effort between the bank and the cloud provider.
It has to be. Both parties have a responsibility to ensure that the data is protected, and they need to work together to make sure that the cloud environment is as secure as possible.
Now, finally, let's talk about third-party risk management. What are some of the concrete steps that banks are taking to manage the vulnerabilities that can come from working with external vendors?
Managing third-party risk is a complex process, but banks are getting much more sophisticated in their approach.
How so?
Well, for one thing, they're conducting much more thorough security assessments of their vendors. They're not just taking the vendor's word for it anymore. They're actually going in and looking at their security practices, their systems, and their overall security posture.
So it's like a deep dive into the vendor's security.
Exactly. And they're not just doing this once, they're doing it on an ongoing basis.
Yeah.
Because security threats are constantly evolving.
So it's a continuous process of monitoring and evaluation.
Right. And then, in addition to assessments, banks are also incorporating stringent cybersecurity requirements into their contracts with vendors. They're making it clear that security is a top priority and that the vendor is expected to meet certain standards. And they're holding the vendor accountable for meeting those standards.
So it's about setting clear expectations and making sure the vendor follows through.
Exactly. And it's about having a process in place to manage any security incidents that do occur. Because no matter how good your security is, there's always the possibility that something could go wrong.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but I want to shift gears now and talk about the future. What are some of the key trends and emerging strategies that are going to shape the landscape of cybersecurity and banking in the years to come?
Well, one thing's for sure. The threats are only going to get more sophisticated. Cyber criminals are constantly innovating, and they're always looking for new ways to exploit vulnerabilities.
So what can banks do to stay ahead of the game?
Well, one of the key trends we're seeing is the rise of zero-trust security. This is a security model that assumes that no one, not even internal users, can be trusted by default. So everything has to be verified all the time.
That sounds pretty strict.
It is. But it's becoming increasingly necessary in today's world, where the traditional network perimeter is disappearing.
Can you explain that a bit more?
Sure. In the past, security was all about building a wall around your network and keeping the bad guys out. But nowadays, with cloud computing, mobile devices, and the Internet of Things, that perimeter is becoming increasingly porous.
So the bad guys can come from anywhere.
Exactly. So instead of trying to build an impenetrable wall, zero-trust security focuses on verifying every user and every device every time they try to access a resource. It's about constantly checking identities, authenticating access, and monitoring activity.
It sounds like it's a much more granular approach to security.
It is, and it's a much more effective approach in today's environment because it means that even if an attacker does manage to get inside your network, they're still limited in what they can do. They can't just roam around freely and access whatever they want.
So zero trust is about minimizing the damage that an attacker can do, even if they do manage to breach your defenses.
Exactly. And it's about assuming that a breach is inevitable and being prepared for it.
That makes sense. Now, another trend we're seeing is the increasing use of artificial intelligence and machine learning for security purposes. We've already talked about some of the ways that AI is being used today, but what about the future? How is AI going to transform cybersecurity in the banking sector?
Well, I think AI is going to become even more important in the years to come. It's going to be used to automate a lot of the tasks that security professionals currently do manually, like threat detection, incident response, and vulnerability management.
So AI is going to free up security professionals to focus on the more strategic aspects of their jobs.
Exactly. And it's also going to allow them to do their jobs more effectively. AI-powered security tools can analyze huge volumes of data much faster than any human could, and they can spot patterns and anomalies that humans might miss. So AI is going to help banks to detect and respond to threats much more quickly and effectively.
It sounds like AI is going to be a game changer for cybersecurity.
It already is. And it's only going to become more important as the threats become more sophisticated.
Now, finally, I want to talk about the human element of cybersecurity, because at the end of the day, technology is only part of the solution. What can banks do to foster a strong security culture within their organizations?
That's a great question. And it's something that a lot of banks are really focusing on these days, because they realize that their employees are their first line of defense against cyber attacks.
So how do they go about building that security culture?
Well, it starts with education and awareness. You need to make sure that your employees understand the threats, the risks, and the best practices for protecting themselves and the bank. And you need to do this on an ongoing basis because the threat landscape is constantly changing.
So it's not just a one-time training session.
No, it has to be an ongoing process, and it has to be engaging.
Yeah.
You can't just bombard your employees with dry technical information. You need to make it relevant to their jobs, and you need to make it interesting.
Like using real-world examples and case studies.
Exactly. And then, in addition to education, you also need to create a culture where security is everyone's responsibility. You need to empower your employees to report suspicious activity, to speak up if they see something that doesn't look right. And you need to make it clear that security is a top priority for the bank.
So it's about creating a culture of vigilance.
Exactly. Because at the end of the day, the best security system in the world won't do any good if your employees aren't following best practices and reporting potential threats.
All right, so to sum up what we've discussed today, it sounds like banks are facing a really challenging and ever-evolving cybersecurity landscape. They're dealing with everything from sophisticated nation-state actors to opportunistic cybercriminals, and the threats are only getting more complex.
That's right. It's a constant arms race.
But the good news is that banks are fighting back. They're investing heavily in new technologies and strategies to bolster their defenses. They're using AI and machine learning to detect and respond to threats more effectively. They're strengthening their endpoint security, they're improving their data backups, and they're developing comprehensive incident response plans.
And they're also working to foster a stronger security culture within their organizations.
Exactly. They're educating their employees about the threats, they're empowering them to report suspicious activity, and they're making it clear that security is a top priority.
So while the challenges are certainly significant, I think banks are well positioned to meet them head on.
Well, that's encouraging to hear. But it's also clear that this is an issue that's not going away anytime soon. Cybersecurity is going to continue to be a major concern for banks and for all of us for the foreseeable future.
Absolutely. It's a battle that we're all in together.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. I think our listeners will find this information really valuable.
It's been my pleasure.
And for our listeners out there, I'd like to leave you with a final thought to ponder. We've talked a lot about the technical aspects of cybersecurity, but I think it's important to also consider the broader implications of this issue. As our financial systems become increasingly interconnected and reliant on technology, what are the long-term risks and challenges that we need to be thinking about? How do we ensure that our financial systems are resilient and secure in the face of increasingly sophisticated cyber threats? And how do we balance the need for security with the need for privacy and individual freedom? I think these are questions that are going to become even more important in the years to come.
Definitely food for thought.
Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.
See you then.